Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our potential tropical cyclone 1 update of our potential tropical system in the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to go over impacts and what to expect with this system regardless. And I think that's the key point that we need to kind of write home is regardless of whether or not this becomes a tropical system, because that is still somewhat up in the air at this point, given just the general complexity of the system. And I'll show you, it definitely is very complex. But besides that, we also have some other areas of interest we're going to watch. Let's all break it down right now in our update. Thanks for stopping by. Let's get started. First off, once again, and probably the main focus is potential tropical cyclone 1. A storm right now with 40-mile-per-hour winds. So if this were actually to become and be designated a tropical system, it would go straight to being named Alberto instead of being a tropical depression, since it already has tropical storm force winds, and the minimum central pressure is 999 millibars. And pretty interesting that a storm that is only 40 miles per hour has a central pressure of 999 millibars. Once again, it just goes to show the size of the system and, in general, the monsoonal sort of nature, which is why the pressure is generally lower within this system. And that's generally going to be a theme with potential tropical cyclone 1, although we'll review that in a moment. But looking beyond potential tropical cyclone 1, we have first off, an area of interest in the Bahamas near the southeast coast. This is not looking as likely to develop as we thought several days ago that it might have had a chance to. And then we also have another area of interest, once again, in the Bay of Campeche. So it seems like if maybe this system right here that we have right now doesn't develop, we might have at least another chance to see something spin out of the Bay of Campeche, or that's at least according to the models, that there might be the Central American gyre that kind of lingers on, and then something else tries to come up and move northward, and maybe we'll see something else consolidate, or at least attempt to, in the Bay of Campeche once again. So there's a 20% chance for that. But just the big story, if we take a look at a satellite image of potential tropical cyclone 1, I mean, just look at it. It's huge, almost encompassing half of the Gulf of Mexico. And this is really, I think, the biggest story to write home about. We have the southern part of this system, which is bringing rains to Mexico, especially the Yucatan Peninsula, and rains still lasting across portions of Central America. And then there's this northern part of the system, which is bringing heavy rains and already flash flooding, I think, probably, to portions of southern Texas and even Louisiana too. And this rain is only going to spread inland over Texas, and we're going to see an increased chance for flash flooding, heavy rains, all kinds of flooding issues over Texas, regardless of whether or not this becomes a system, because it is actually becomes a question on whether or not this actually is able to concentrate enough before it moves inland over Mexico, over northeastern Mexico, rough either tomorrow night or around Thursday morning. And that's another thing too, is that the wind aspects of it, that this is expected to make landfall in northern Mexico. And I'm actually just going to show you the cone for this. You saw how broad this is on the satellite, but just look at how that actually translates to in terms of the wind field. I mean, this is massive. This is such a huge storm in terms of its influence. And because of that, this storm is only going to make landfall if it becomes a tropical system. Or regardless, the low pressure of this system will make landfall in northeastern Mexico. But because of the size, tropical storm conditions, tropical storm warnings are in effect all the way up into the central Texas coastline. So this is a huge storm with lasting impacts, but big widespread impacts. And I think this is something that is the main concern of this system. Yes, there will be wind aspect to it. There's tropical storm warnings in effect for northeastern Mexico and Texas, but the flooding rains will really be, I think, a big thing, because they'll not only be over Texas, but they'll also be over Mexico too, and even portions of southern Mexico as well, which will still get in on the heavy rain. And just to really quickly show you on the 850 millibar vorticity, just to show how broad it is, look at all of this vorticity in the Gulf of Mexico. This is potential tropical cyclone 1. This is entirely what you see on the satellite here. And let me actually maybe refresh the satellite a little bit, because I think it's a little bit behind, but I'm not sure if it makes that much of a difference. But you can generally see what I'm getting at. This is the general broad circulation that we have with this system. We have, I guess, northern part in here, and this is more associated with the convective sort of area that we have in the northern Gulf, which seems like there's one dominant-ish area of vorticity there that maybe is trying to compete alongside with another area, especially in the southern Gulf, and you can see that actually reflected on the satellite. There's an area that's a little bit more to the south that also may be competing as well. And this is generally what the Central American gyre systems are. They're part of this one big, broad envelope of vorticity that is stretched out over a very large area, much, much bigger than our tropical waves are. And they're all full of these competing low-level vorticities, and it's really dependent on when we'll see one that dominates over, and that ends up being the vorticity area that consolidates and becomes the main center of the system. And we just have a whole bunch of those competing vorticities sort of things in the system right now, which is why it's so broad. And it really does, regardless of whether or not this does become a system, man, those impacts in terms of heavy rains and flash flooding will definitely be present in Mexico and Texas, regardless of whether or not this does become a system. And I think the key messages for potential tropical cyclone 1 by the National Hurricane Center for every single system that actually does bring some sort of any impacts to land. The National Hurricane Center releases these key messages, and they outline them. They said rainfall associated with potential tropical cyclone 1 will impact the large regions of Central America, and then north across northeastern Mexico and into southern Texas. And then once again, they also say moderate coastal flooding is likely along much of the Texas coast through midweek. So there's that lasting aspect of these impacts. And then obviously they have tropical storm conditions expected for portions of Texas, south of San Luis Pass, along portions of the coast of northeastern Mexico within the warned area. So basically right along where they have tropical storm warnings, that's where they have conditions where they're expecting it to be tropical storm conditions is where they're expecting it. But I think the biggest sort of key message to take away is that they mention, and this is what we should all especially take away from the system, is that users are reminded not to focus on the exact forecast of the system, because the disturbance is very large with rainfall, coastal flooding, and wind impacts that are likely to occur far from the center along the coasts of Texas and northeastern Mexico. And I think when you go back to this cone and they mention that, I think it makes total sense, because look at how expansive the wind field is compared to the exact forecast track, which this cone only indicates where the track will be, not where this whole wind field is exactly going to lie along the coastline. And that, I think, that is the biggest misconception amongst a lot of people, is they don't look at the storm overall in terms of its impacts, and they only look for whether or not there will be a direct landfall on this, whether or not they will deal with a direct landfall. And I don't think and whether or not this becomes a name, and once again, whether or not you're going to get a direct landfall of the system, the impacts are just going to be absolutely tremendous in terms of its scope of where it impacts. Lots of gusty winds with this system, although the winds are not, I don't think it's the biggest issue with this storm. Just going back to the satellite image, you could just see of how expansive it is. It's really going to be the rain that's going to be the biggest issue. But obviously, since there is that component of the wind, we do have the storm surge forecast when we talk about flooding being an issue for Texas. There definitely will be storm surge as much as 2 to 4 feet from Sargent to Sabine Pass, Texas, and even into the Galveston Bay. There might be up to 2 to 4 feet of storm surge as well. So once again, going back to this idea that the impacts will be very far reaching and very far away, very far removed from the center. We're expecting the peak storm surge to be all the way up in here through the central and northern Texas coastline, and the forecast is for the storm to make landfall in northeastern Mexico. So definitely goes into put into perspective just how widespread the storm will be. And I think the biggest thing is to not focus once again on their center point. And by the way, really quickly before we move on, I do want to take a moment to talk about, if you're at all interested, just to get an idea of where I get all of these graphics by the National Hurricane Center. This is for every single storm that the National Hurricane Center has. If you click, let's really quickly go back, just take it a step back. If you click on the National Hurricane Center homepage, because if you go to nationalhurricanecenter.com, this is the homepage that you'll be in. This is the first screen that you'll see. Just click on the system that you're tracking. So in our case, this is potential tropical cyclone 1, and they are automatically, the first thing that they show is the key messages. But not only that, they also have the rest of all the impacts and graphics that we're showing. We show the cone, which they have here, and then they also have the rainfall forecast as well for Texas. It's all in this kind of inventory of all these graphics that you could see. They even have wind speed probabilities as well. So if you're at all interested in taking a look at what exact impacts, what the exact concern is of the system that you're tracking, this bar is really easy to use, and it's free to the public. I mean, this is taxpayer money that we're using to be able to fund NOAA and these websites like this. But most importantly, I think that they're free to the public, and they're resources that we could use to be able to track. You don't have to wait for weather officials to make the update or tell you the information, because sometimes they can be a little bit misleading. If not, you could just go once again to nationalhurricanecenter.com, not .gov, not .com, gov, since this is a government-funded website. Once again, with our taxpayer money, and then just click on whatever system you're tracking, and you'll go to a page like this, and they'll have all the graphics and information that you need. Basically right at your fingertips, right at your screen. You're going to have everything you need for what you're trying to look for. And I think it is really neat, and it's very resourceful, and we'll definitely revisit this often throughout the season. All right, so now that I said that, let's move on to the models. Although I'm not even sure if the models are really that great to really look at in terms of this storm, because once again, it's a really broad storm. And especially the global models don't really have that much of a great handle on big kind of gyre situations like this. Plus, I think because of the general nature of this storm, I think it's really much more of a real-time tracking situation more than see what the models have. Although I guess you could use the hurricane models, which we're not going to go over, but you can look at them on your own time with tropicaltidbits.com. That's where I use all my models anyways, by Levi Cowan. Gotta give the credit where the credit is due. But anyways, looking at the GFS, let's move it out into time, and you can see that the general theme of the system remains that it'll be a very broad system over the Gulf. 24 hours in, you could already start seeing impacts probably along the Texas and Mexico coastline. But the center, even 24 hours in, the center of the storm is probably still going to be over land in the Bay of Campeche. And it seems like the GFS, even here, it does not seem to fully go inland by the time we get to hour 48. So roughly 2 days from now, this, I guess, has over the Bay of Campeche, where maybe it tries to concentrate a little bit. I guess you could see the GFS, at least on the current model run. It tries to develop some sort of more central area where it tries to consolidate, and it seems like it tries to do that a little bit, but obviously it runs out of time, and then it moves into Mexico, and then that is the end of that. But I think the general idea that we're looking at with this storm is that it'll remain broad, its impacts will remain widespread across portions of Texas and Mexico. And I think that is the biggest thing to take away from it, regardless of whether or not it does become a named system. Because even if this does become a named storm, I don't think that this system won't automatically shrink. It's still gonna be very widespread in its impacts regardless. And I think that's just the main story to take away from the system. And then we move out into time to see what else the GFS has. As I did mention, this is roughly 5 days from now, so not exactly a week out, but 5 days. Nothing much happening except if you look back in the Bay of Campeche, you could still see we generally have some sort of drier circulation that remains. Roughly about a week out or so, you could see as well, remains a very broad system in the Gulf, but it seems like right as it's near the Mexican coastline, or probably just some sort of coastline again, the GFS tries to spin up something, but even that too kind of stays into Mexico, or at least, this does not emerge back again over the Bay of Campeche. So maybe if we do have something else that occurs once again in the Bay of Campeche, maybe it might as well be a repeat of what we have right now with potential tropical cyclone 1. But regardless, I think at least what the GFS is trying to tell us is that after this storm, we may not be done. We may have one more sort of thing to watch. And we'll just have to see what exactly happens with this system. It is June though, and we are in hurricane season, so our eyes are definitely now to be on watching the tropics. So getting this kind of activity and getting, signals at least is definitely not surprising. Whether or not they do develop, obviously, is the big question. But especially the fact that we're getting a lot of these signals, not just one or two of them. We already have this system, and then there's also the Bahamas. They might not develop even potential tropical cyclone 1, as I mentioned before, especially because of its broad nature. It still might have struggles and might as well end up not becoming Alberto. But regardless, these were still signals, and it looks like we still have more signals on the way that probably, I guarantee you, one of these signals will definitely make it the full route and become our first tropical storm of the season. And the fact that we're getting a lot of these, I think, does go into, it basically puts into perspective what we've all been thinking, that this season is going to be active, that there's going to be lots of potential for lots of activity to occur, and it generally falls in line with what all the climate models are saying, and also the background state as well for the hurricane season. It's all there. And I definitely think over the next several weeks, things will definitely begin to get more interesting. But for now, obviously, we got to focus on potential tropical cyclone 1, and we'll see what the future of it has in store for us over the next several days, of course, beyond today. With that being said, though, I'm going to end off for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. And we will talk again with another update tomorrow.